and the Prerogative Kitchen for helping us cover the expenses of him staying overnight. Pollard provided him with a place to stay, and Prerogative gave him dinner. So if you go to Red Lodge, thank those, go into those places and thank people. I think they really like that. So I think most of you probably know a lot about Chris, so I'm not going to, it's on the back of the book. So I think without further ado, I will turn it over to Chris and let him talk to you.
Okay, testing. How does that sound? We good? Well, thank you, Bernie. Absolutely, and thank you, One Book Billings, and everybody in Red Lodge. And like to also mention Corby Skinner, who was just a promoter of humanities in general in the area, and he's tremendous. I know he's in Beirut, lucky guy. Just briefly to discuss, humanities in general and how reading and music and poetry and all that can just enrich our lives. And thank you all for being here and obviously taking an interest. And Hemingway is a controversial figure. A lot of people either love him or hate him. But I think it's a little more nuanced than that. I think a lot of people get caught up in the pop culture caricature of Hemingway. I always think of The Most Interesting Man in the World, the Dos Equis ad campaign. And that's that. And in the beginning of my kind of deep dive into Hemingway, initially I was somewhat put off by him and put off by the bravado and the machismo and the tough guy image. And then in order to do the research for this book, I had to pretty much read everything. And I realized that the external public image was so different from the man who's, he presents himself on the page. He kind of used his typewriter as almost like a psychiatrist's couch. And any problems he had in his life, eventually he would get them down on paper, whether it was his wounding in World War I that ended up being a farewell to arms. The impotence that came from it ended up in Sun Also Rises. His mother twinned him with his sister and dressed him as a girl for a long time. And that didn't really come out until The Garden of Eden was published posthumously. And of course, the suicide of his father, which is such a big part of my book, his life, and his time in Montana and Wyoming. And it took until For Whom the Bell Tolls for him to kind of shed the weight of that. And he sheds that weight by dropping the gun his father used into a lake in the Beartooths. And that's like the physical shedding of that weight. And then the literary shedding of that weight is when he told that story in For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I think that allowed him to move on from that. And yes, sure, it ended in suicide, but it was 32 years after his father. And so it might have come a lot sooner if he wasn't able to use his writing and use his audience to deal with these things in his life. So I did grow more sympathetic to Hemingway as I read the work. So also what I want to talk about is Hemingway in Montana, because when we think of Hemingway, we think of Key West, we think of the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, and Madrid, and Paris, and Cuba, and all these places. But if we turn to, actually I have the collection right here, and this was originally the first 49 stories, and this preface he wrote in Cook City, and as I was digging through all the work, and I'm reading the letters, and he's writing to his editor, Max Perkins, and he's saying, I'm gonna write the preface to this new collection. And so I read the preface, and right here, like on the second paragraph, he talks about what he's written in Madrid, and then he says, oh, it was always a good place for working. So was Paris, so were Key West, Florida in the cool months, and the ranch near Cook City, Montana. So there he puts Cook City, Montana, fourth on his list of favorite places to write. So then I started realizing that there's some real significance. And I think because of how remote Cook City is and the El Barti is, and there's no universities or anything like that, this man, who is probably the most overstudied man in literary history, there was a gap in the scholarship. And, I'm a bartender by trade, so I didn't really belong in this world. But because of having lived in Cook City for so long, a lot of the places he referenced, whether it was in Green Hills of Africa or For Whom the Bell Tolls or The Gambler, the Nun on the Radio, Man of the World, it was like this is a significant part of his literary biography. And the El Barti actually sits in Wyoming, but it's 10 miles from Cook City. So he sent off final drafts from the Cook City General Store of To Have and Have Not and Death in the Afternoon. And of course, Robert Jordan, the protagonist of For Whom the Bell Tolls, is from Red Lodge. And so all of a sudden we see this like massive Montana connection that's been kind of overlooked by the scholarship. And then when we look at his family, Patrick Hemingway, the last surviving son, still lives in Bozeman. Valerie Hemingway, who will be at the conference this summer, she is at the University of Montana, Montana State. And then Jack Hemingway attended the University of Montana, and he was actually fly fishing the waters of Missoula at the same time Norman McLean was. And so we have this connection to river runs through it. And I have a friend, Bill Grover, who's going to present a paper called The Big Two-Hearted River Runs Through It. And he's making this connection between McLean and Hemingway. And also, after leaving the ranch, the ranch was in Montana, but Lawrence Nordquist, who owns the ranch, was more of a Cook City guy. And his wife, Olive Nordquist, when they divorced, opened the Nordquist Cabins in Cook City. And then, so after he leaves, the next book that comes out is For Whom the Bell Tolls, and he chooses Red Lodge as a home for Robert Jordan, his protagonist. And then the following book, it's 10 years later, is Across the River and Into the Trees, and Colonel Cantwell is also from Montana. And I don't know if anybody's read that. It's not his best. But there's one scene where they're driving towards Venice, and his driver is from Wyoming. His name's Jackson. And then Cantwell is from Montana. And they're arguing about the toughest towns in the world. And Venice, and he's like, yeah, this place, Venice, it's a port town, it's an old town, and it's a tough town. And Jackson is saying, oh, well, what about Rollins? And what about Gillette? Like, these are tough towns. And he says, this town of Venice, this is as tough a town as any town out there, except for Cook City, Montana, on the day they have the old timers fish fry. And so the book that would come after that, chronologically, it wasn't published till 1970, is Islands of the Stream, and that's Thomas Hudson. And he also is a rancher from Montana. And his friend is Hemingway kind of switches the roles. And his friend is a writer, and he encourages him to go to his ranch in Montana to cure his writer's block. So he just kind of leaves these clues throughout the work about how important this region was to him and to his work. So, this conference and talks like this and the talk in Red Lodge, I'm just trying to emphasize how important Montana and Wyoming, but in my mind to a lesser extent, belongs in the discussion with Key West and Madrid and all those other places. I'm probably going to focus mostly on The Gambler, the Nun on the Radio, because that is set right here in Billings at St. Vincent's. And when we read Hemingway, there's a couple of things that you need to understand. One is that all of the work is essentially fictionalized biography. The Nick Adams stories are about him growing up with his father and going to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. And then, like I mentioned, Farewell to Arms is about World War I, his experiences there. And then For Whom the Bell Tolls, even though it's set in Spain, all of his flashbacks when he compares the country to back home, when he compares, he talks, the final line is he could feel his heart beating on the pine needle floor of the forest. And when he was in Spain, he was not looking down a rifle with his heart beating against the pine needle floor of the forest. So he's leaning back on all those memories of his time at the El Barti from 1930 to 1939. Now, The Gambler, the other thing that we need to understand, and I don't know if you guys have covered this in your discussion, is the iceberg theory. Did you guys talk about this? A little bit. Well, the iceberg theory is that And we all know that he wrote short stories and short declarative sentences, simple language and all that, but the theory is that what's presented on the page is the tip of the iceberg. And so that's why everything's pretty simple, but the real meaning is the monolith below the water. So you can read a short story and think you understand it, and then you need to like dig deeper for the meaning. And he did this sort of intentionally, I think, to protect his favorite places, to protect the people in his books, and I would say his favorite people, but he had a bad habit of bashing a lot of his friends and fellow writers and critics, and so he would just kind of change things a little bit, or change the ending. And so once we kind of understand this, that it is his actual biography, and you're actually taking a deep dive into somebody's psyche when you read Hemingway. And that's why the interest is still high, because you can read, a lot of us are forced to read things in high school or in college, and we think we've read them, and then, you grow up a little bit and you go back and read it, and you're like, oh, I missed that. I missed that. Oh, that's what he was getting at. And I always tell the story. I had the Red Lodge Historical Society come to Cook City, and I asked them, I was like, so who's read For Whom the Bell Tolls? And every single one of them raised their hand, and I was like, do you guys know where the protagonist is from? And they're like, no. I was like, well, he was from Red Lodge, so you might think you've read it, but it's worth a second look, So when it comes to The Gambler, the Nun on the Radio, I don't know if you guys have read that as part of your group or your discussion, but everybody from Billings should, because it's the one story that takes place here. And it's about his recuperation from a car accident. And this came after his first trip to the El Bartee, where he'd shot his first bighorn sheep, his first elk, his first bear, and he'd also written 350 pages of Death in the Afternoon. And as he's driving out, he's got Dos Passos with him, and he's got Floyd Allington, who is a bootlegger and camp cook and hunter from Red Lodge. So it's this like weird group. They're in a Model A, 1928 Model A, and Floyd Allington's in the rumble seat with a bootleg bottle of bourbon, and they're driving out to Billings, and they're going to head to Key West, and they are in a car accident right outside of Laurel, and they give I think one of them suggested it was the lights from an oncoming car. Another one suggested it was a car backing out of a driveway. Another one suggested it was loose gravel. So we're going to blame it on the bourbon. A passerby picks him up, takes him to the hospital, and there's a great history of St. Vincent's where they talk about this. And when he signs in with his broken arm, probably signs with his left hand, and they ask him his occupation, and he said writer, and the nurse at the hospital wrote Rider, R-I-D-E-R, which is hilarious. But anyway, so then he's in St. Vincent's for almost 6 weeks. And the story, The Gambler, the Nun on the Radio, is about that convalescence, and it's really interesting as to what he focuses on. He's in there with two guys that have been shot at a card game in Red Lodge. One is a Mexican and one is a Russian, and the Mexican's been gut shot twice. But he doesn't complain, and then they tell him he's not going to walk again, and he's like, well, I don't really need my legs, I'm a guitar player and a card player. And he's just this kind of like stoic guy who just accepts his fate and accepts his misfortune. And this is sort of the beginning of the Hemingway code hero. And so Hemingway, he's got the doctor, he's got the nuns, he's listening to baseball, he's got all the guys at the ranch, but he focuses on Cayetano and this stoic acceptance of your fate. And the T-shirt we're going to have for the Hemingway conference has a quote from Farewell to Arms, and I believe it's, the world breaks everyone, but some are stronger in the broken places. And so his admiration for Cayetano is the beginning of this code hero. And when we move on from there, and you think of the next novel, it's To Have and Have Not. And To Have and Have Not, Harry's got, the final gun battle on the boat, he's lost his arm. And so all of his heroes, and then Robert Jordan ends up with the broken leg and the broken heart. And it's like how all these people kind of overcome this adversity. And these are the people he admired. And some of these people are from Montana, and you can tell, or Wyoming, and you can tell this in the work. Another one of these characters is John Stabe from Wyoming, and he was in the Kaiser's Army in World War I, and but he was deaf, and he was a mountain man and a hugely respected mountain man. And they, in Green Hills of Africa, they talk about having to throw a pebble at him when they hear an elk bugle. And but of all the people at the ranch, you know, Floyd Allington and Ivan Wallace and Lawrence Norquist, like, it's John Stabe who makes it into the Green Hills of Africa, and that's probably because of his disability and Hemingway's admiration for his ability to overcome it. So the code hero is another important thing to think about when we think about Hemingway, and that, I believe, started with The Gambler, the Nun, and the Radio, which is once again set right here in Billings. There was also several other stories that he wrote here. The Light of the World was written at the El Bartee Ranch. The Natural History of the Dead was written at the El Bartee Ranch. The final drafts of all those books were sent from the Cook City General Store. So the Montana connection is real. And when we look for the code hero in other Hemingway stories, we see Ollie Anderson from The Killers, and he's this mysterious character, and two hitmen come to kill him, and he won't leave, he won't call the police, he won't do anything, he just kind of stoically accepts his fate. And so we see this like growing, this continuing of this code hero. And then when I went to Paris to present a paper connecting his final short story, and that's at the end of the book. I'm sure, hopefully you guys read that too. There was some suggestion that this story was set in Michigan or something like that. And this was kind of my way into the scholarship, because when I read the story, the two bars that it's set in are the Pilot and the Index. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pilot and Index, the two mountains right outside of Cook City, but there's no Pilot and the Index in Michigan. And then they talk about it's this horrible, terrible fight that takes place on the ice in front of the bar, and in the light of the bar, and snow piled up all around it, and there only being one road in. And I'm just like, yeah, that's Cook City. And so, and then Blindy, who is the character he gets blinded in that fight. So there we have another disability. And then he also, after having his eyes gouged, then he gets his genitals stomped on, and then he lets out this almighty scream, which breaks his vocal cords. And so here's this like crusty old guy, but he's still genial. You know, he hitchhikes to the bar and he poaches the gambling machines and things like that. And this is Hemingway's final story. And if we go back, if we consider all of his work, and we go back to his first work, which would be In Our Time, and we go back to his first story, which is Indian Camp, that's the story of Hemingway as a child crossing the lake in the Upper Peninsula and going to an Indian camp, and his father, who's a doctor, is going to help deliver a baby. And it's got his uncle, his father, and him as a child. Why his father would take him to an event like this, we don't know, and we start getting an inclination of why Hemingway was so messed up. But after the baby is born via cesarean section, it's like in the dark, in the middle of the night, it's bloody and violent, and then the father of the baby kills himself, cuts his own throat. And it's graphic, but this is his very first short story. He's writing about himself as a child, and he's writing this in his early 20s. And as they row back across the lake, you know, he's saying, "Dad, do many men kill themselves? And do many women kill themselves?" And all of this. And we see how, you know, suicide and darkness is ever present in Hemingway. And this is his very first story, and so we're introduced to Nick Adams, or the fictionalized Hemingway, in this world of darkness and violence and suicide. And then the final story, which was published in the 1957 edition, 100th anniversary edition of the Atlantic Monthly, is A Man of the World. And this is Blindy, who's in this terrible fight in Cook City, and the other guy in the fight is still in town, and he's got a hole in his cheek. And the guy with, you know, the disfigured face is bitter and doesn't want to engage with people and anything like that. And, Blindy makes fun of him and says, he'll never be a man of the world. And so what we see is Hemingway's first character entering through violence, darkness, and death. And then his final character is left blind, voiceless, and impotent. And so we kind of get this progression of Hemingway the man through the work. And it's fascinating. And once again, you kind of get to see some of why he was who he was and why he was such a controversial character and why he struggled, and through suicide and through trauma. And there's a lot of things we don't know that we know now about trauma that we don't know, that we didn't know then. He was a boxer, he was a football player, he was in 3 wars. He had a skylight fall on his head. And the other great story from Cook City is when his horse bolts into the trees and he gets gashed in the lip and he gets gashed in the knee, and off he goes to Cody to get a prescription bottle of liquor. So it's just like this chain of traumatic events in his life. And as he grew older, he just came to really admire the people that could withstand that adversity and that injury and use it as motivation, or at least still be able to enjoy life and be a man of the world. So that's the kind of fun part about Hemingway. You'll find out what he's really getting at. And so The Gambler, the Nun, and the Radio, he talks about his convalescence, and that story is essentially synopsizes what happened in the Billings Hospital, but that accident and the recuperation from it continues through the work. He broke his arm in the car accident, and there's a great Montana PBS documentary about this called Paradise and Purgatory, Hemingway at the LBRT and in St. Vincent's Hospital. And you should be able to find that. I think it should be here at the library. When he breaks his arm, but in the story, he talks about his leg being broken. So he changes his character to, gives him another name, changes the arm break to a leg break. But in his letters, the way he describes the break, he says, a compound fracture was avoided, but I could see the bone poking through the skin. And then when we look at For Whom the Bell Tolls, when Robert Jordan breaks his leg spoiler alert, at the end of For Whom the Bell Tolls, he describes it exactly the same way. It's his leg, and he describes it not compound, but poking through the skin. So just that accident, not only does it make it into Gambler on the Radio, it also makes it into For Whom the Bell Tolls. And then in Green Hills of Africa, which, when I first started this project, I was just reading the things that were about Cook City, or just reading the things that he wrote while he was in Cook City, and then I decided, no, I gotta read everything, because there's these little snippets, and there's these little snippets in there. And so I read The Green Hills of Africa, and he's talking about watching horseflies just torture a horse, like biting it under the tails and watching the horse suffer and things like that. And he said, that's the worst suffering I've ever imagined, except the one time I broke my arm. And then he talks about how lying there with his writing, shooting, and fishing arm broken, and wondering if the life he knows is all those things is over, and he's fretting about it. And then he talks about how an elk must feel if you shoot it and it gets away. And then he talks about how that changed him as a hunter. Like, he's not just gonna shoot wildly at things running away, he's only gonna shoot if he has a kill shot. So it finds its way into The Gambler, the Nun, and the Radio, it finds its way into the Green Hills of Africa, and it finds its way into For Whom the Bell Tolls, and it also affects him as a hunter. So when you read The Gambler, the Nun, and the Radio, it's kind of fun and it's kind of rollicking, but there is meaning underneath that story, and it permeates throughout Hemingway's work. And there's one other thing. I presented a paper to the Modern Literary Association on Winner Take Nothing, a collection of short stories that came out in 1933 after his first 2 trips to the LBRT. And this book, it's filled, well, it has Wine of Wyoming in it, which is set in Sheridan. It has A Gambler, None on the Radio, which is set in Billings. And it also has a bunch of stories about suicide, because his father killed himself just less than a year before his first trip to the LBRT. So that was on his mind the entire time. And then his mother sent him the gun his father used to kill himself. And so he's carrying this around with him throughout his time at the LBRT. And he's also surrounded by death there, you know, whether it's hunting or whether they're killing horses to bait bears. And, or there are some high-profile murders in Cook City back then, you know. You can imagine how wild it was in the 30s and the gold mining days. And there was the murder of the original homesteader of the LBRT, and that found its way into snows of Kilimanjaro. And his name was Jim Smith. He was killed by a guy named Tony Rodashek in a dispute over hay. But so he was always close to death, and he was always close to firearms, and he had his father's gun with him. And that is the gun that ends up in Froze to Death Lake, although that's somewhat controversial as to whether that's the lake. And we were talking just a minute ago. I don't recommend anybody looking for it. Okay, so now we do, and also that convalescence in the hospital here, the paper I presented to the Modern Literary Association suggests that perhaps while he was there, he was on the morphine and he was drinking bootleg liquor, and he was facing the end of his career and the end of his hunting career and fishing career, and he was bitter. And Pauline comes to help him get through this, Pauline, his second wife, and all the visitors that came to see him, you know, Archie McLeish, and you know, just some of his friends that come to see him, they leave actually feeling more sorry for Pauline than for Hemingway, because he's just taking it out on her and he's just berating her, and he always resented her wealth, even though he depended on it. You know, her Uncle Gus like bought them the car, kind of funded the trip to Africa, and I think that hurt him, you know, as a man, because it was before he was really able to sustain himself through his writing. And if we read Snows of Kilimanjaro, it is about a writer dying under a tree in Africa, and he just relentlessly berates his wife, even though she's trying to take care of him. And I think that entire dialogue comes from Hemingway's stay here at St. Vincent's. And so even though it's just one story out of 57, and even though at first look it's not the most important story, it's not The Short Happy Life of Francis McNamara, it's not Clean Well Lighted Place, but it shouldn't be dismissed, and it should be part of the scholarship. And it's set in Billings. So, and here we are. So this is something we should kind of honor and appreciate. There is a TV movie of The Gambler, the Nun, and the Radio that I found from 1960, and the conference is going to start in Billings. We're going to have people fly into Billings and then go to Sheridan and then go to Cook City and then over the Beartooth Pass back to Billings. So it would be nice. I don't know if anybody is, you know, I'm kind of counting on Corby for this, but it would be fun to show that movie on the night before the conference, and then kind of just include Billings in the conversation. You know, the Red Lodge part is easy, the Cook City part is easy, the Sheridan part is easy, but Billings has a role to play in this too. And speaking of the conference, are you guys aware of the conference this summer, the 2022 International Hemingway Conference? No, so the International Hemingway Conference has been going on, I think, since the early 70s, and they're usually in places like Paris or Chicago or New York or Key West. But on the back of this book, I had some scholars come up, and I kind of took them around to show them the sites, and one of them named Stephen Brown was like, you have to introduce this to the Hemingway Society. Like, these guys don't know anything about this. So I wrote a proposal to bring the next International Hemingway Conference to Cook City. And it was originally going to be in Cuba, the one after Paris, and then after the Trump election, it became obvious that nobody was going to be going to Cuba in the next few years. And so they sent out an emergency call for site proposals, and I put one in, and then traveled to Paris to present my story connecting his final short story to Cook City, but also to support the proposal. And one personal milestone in my life was, you know, I had to, you know, take 2 weeks off and drive to Portland and drop my kids off, fly to London, take the Eurostar, get to Paris, and almost didn't make it. You know, it was like the 4-hour wait for the Eurostar, and I scrambled, and the very first event was at the Eiffel Tower, and I'd never been there. And right before the whole thing started, the president of the Hemingway Society pulled me into the lobby of the Eiffel Tower and said, "You know what? Your proposal won. Like, the next conference is coming to Montana and Wyoming." So it was quite the coup, and of course it was scheduled for 2020 and then canceled because of COVID. And so it's been a long endeavor, but it is coming finally in July. And it's gonna be 4 days in Sheridan and 3 days in Cook City. And we are suggesting a loop, and there's actually a bus tour you can take. You could take the bus from Billings, and it'll take you to Sheridan and shuttle you around the events, and then through the Bighorns, which is where he worked on Farewell to Arms and really first started fly fishing, and then through the Absarokas and past the Elbartee and through all that country that he hunted and loved, and it was, I kind of feel like it was personal Shangri-La, you know. It was this time in his life when he was probably at his best. You know, he finished Farewell to Arms in Sheridan, wrote most of To Have and Have Not and Death in the Afternoon in Cook City, and then got started on For Whom the Bell Tolls, all in this 11-year gap. And after leaving the area, he didn't publish another novel for 10 years, and he didn't publish another short story for 14 years. And then that was the beginning of his decline. So, you know, not only has this been overlooked, it's also kind of his Belle Epoque. It is his grand era. And my point is that this country, you know, the country that we all call home, there's a reason we all live here, and it can be difficult. Did you guys get that 25 below last week? Yeah, right. Yeah, my pipes froze. And then even to get here, you know, I had to jump on a snowmobile, 13 miles to Pilot Creek, then get in a car, drive to Red Lodge. But we do that because we love it here, and Hemingway did too. And I think he didn't. I think he intentionally tried to keep it secret, you know, because, you know, he loved it and he didn't want to spoil it, and he never really came back. And I'm not sure of why exactly, but you know, he left Pauline at the ranch in 1939. That was the end of his relationship with Pauline, and it was also the beginning of the deterioration of his relationship with his children. Every elk, every deer, every bear, not every deer, every elk, every bear, every sheep he ever shot was within 15, 20 miles of Cook City. And he's also known for fly fishing, which I'm sure some of us enjoy, right? And but when we read Sun Also Rises, they go fishing as a way to recuperate from World War I. You know, there's the ruckus in Pamplona, and then there's the middle section that's about fishing, and he's with an Englishman, an American, and I think a Frenchman. And it's so obvious, much like in the Big Two-Hearted River, that they're just happy to not be at war. And then they use fishing to just keep their mind off it. But they get to the river, and there's a can of worms, and there's a box of flies, and Hemingway character, Jake Barnes, takes the worms. And then if we read The Big Two-Hearted River, he is working with a fly rod, and this, once again, is his kind of escape from the trauma of World War I. But he does have a fly rod, but he's catching grasshoppers, and he's not casting, he's throwing them in the river, and he's drifting them down. And so it's not really fly fishing. So when he starts his fly fishing, he starts in the Bighorns, and then he says to Floyd Allington, one of the bootleggers and camp cooks, you know, that the Clark's Fork is the best fly fishing in the world. And he fishes all throughout that trip, and it's a big part of his work. But when he leaves the area to go to Sun Valley, the trunk of his fly fishing gear gets lost on the railroad. And so we have these pictures of him in Sun Valley, but they're all publicity shots. And essentially, if you read Jack Hemingway's Misadventures of a Fly Fisherman, we find out that was pretty much the end of his fly fishing. So all of his significant big game hunting outside of Africa took place within 15 miles of Cook City. All of the significant fly fishing experience he had was at the Elbartee and on the Clark's Fork and in the lakes around there. So we start to see just how valuable this region was to him. And so hopefully this conference will be an opportunity to just kind of set that in stone. And then whether we attend the conference or not, or if you guys attend the conference or not, it's just going to kind of start and stimulate a conversation and make this a destination. And you know, like I said, a lot of people think they already know enough about Hemingway, but there is something about the way he wrote, the iceberg theory and the ambiguity, to where you can go back and read it again with like a little piece of knowledge. Like if you did not know that his father killed himself, and then you go back and read A Clean, Well-Lighted Place about the old man in the cafe who's a failed suicide. Then you start understanding like why he's writing these stories. And an homage to Switzerland is also in Winter Take Nothing. And in that, at the end of the story, he's talking about his father, and the person he's talking to says, "Oh, you know, I would love to meet him." He says, "Well, you know, that's a shame. I wish you could, but it's a shame because he killed himself." And the guy says, "Oh, well, I'm sure that was a blow to science and his family as well." And the narrator replies, "Well, science took it really well," which essentially means by omission that his family didn't. And and then the final story of Winter Take Nothing is called Fathers and Sons. And if we know, the first fictional Hemingway character is Nick Adams, and that is Hemingway as a boy. But also the Big Two-Hearted River is Hemingway as a man returning from World War II and using the river to kind of cleanse his soul, like as a salve for the trauma he's experienced. And at the end of that book, at the end of that story, a grown-up Nick Adams is driving. There's two Nick Adams stories in Winter Take Nothing: Light of the World, which was written at the LBRT, and historically it's common knowledge that it's pretty much set in the Upper Peninsula because of a boxer by the name of Steve Ketchel, who was known as the Michigan Assassin. And so at that point, people pretty much just say, okay, it's Michigan. But then when you look up Steve Ketchel's boxing career, he left Michigan when he was 12 years old as a child hobo. It was the Depression, and came to Montana, and his first 40 fights were in Montana. And he wrote it as soon as he got to the LBRT in 1932. So even though the scholarship has arrived at this conclusion that story is set in Michigan, it's got a sawmill, it's got Native Americans, it's got a train station, and there's part of me that thinks like, that sounds like Livingston. And then the fact that he sat down and wrote it as soon as he got to the LBRT makes me wonder whether he had an experience on the way in that made him write that. So the paper I presented to the Modern Literary Association, I try to suggest that Hemingway was sort of moving his spiritual home out west. And the fact that the last two Nick Adams stories have this connection, one was written at the LBRT, and the second one, Fathers and Sons, has Hemingway driving in his car with his young son. And he talks about growing up, and he talks a lot about his father. And then his son says to him, you know, why don't we ever go see Papa's grave? Why don't we ever go see Grandpa's grave? And the reasons are pretty obvious, right? Like, Hemingway's still struggling with his father's suicide. And he's like, yeah, no. And then his son says to him, you know, maybe, well, I want to come see your grave when you die. And maybe we could all be buried at the ranch. And so it is as though Hemingway was kind of, one, he was coming here year after year after year, and he's having these great experiences. He's using it as a place to write. He's also accruing experiences that become his work. And then, of the very poignant Father and Sons, the very last book of Winter Take Nothing, he's kind of suggesting that he's going to be buried at the ranch, and what deeper connection is there? And this is something that I've experienced in my 29 years in Cook City. I bartended. I also owned a coffee shop for a while. I raised my kids there. But I would have all these people come in, and I would be like, oh, welcome and all this. And they'll be like, oh, well, we're here to scatter my grandfather's ashes. And they'd say, oh, he worked at the Northeast entrance in 1968 and 69, but he always wanted his ashes scattered here. So people have this like deep emotional bond, and it's because of the wildness, it's because of just the natural beauty, but people gravitate to it, and Hemingway did too. And when we look at his biography by Carlos Baker, which if you guys want to continue your dive into Hemingway, that's essential reading. The life story by Carlos Baker. And if you go to the very last, like I think it's the second to last page, Baker's talking about his deterioration. He's going through shock therapy. He's going through depression. He's losing his skills, and Baker talks about there being still ways to get to him and kind of bring the old, vibrant Hemingway back. And one of those ways, right before he dies, is he gets a book sent to him by Charlie Scribner, his publisher, that's a fly fishing guide to the waters of Yellowstone. And Baker points to this as like, this is days before his suicide. And but that could invigorate him. And so I don't know whether he kept it secret intentionally, but the way he left, his relationship with Pauline had dissolved. In 1939, he gathers all his children at the ranch, all three of them. That's the first time he has all the children there. And then he picks up Billings at the Billings, or picks up Pauline at the Billings airport, and then he's trying to write For Whom the Bell Tolls, and then World War II starts. And he's listening to Hitler rant and rave over the radio at the El Barti, and he knows he has to go. He's been in Spain, he's covered the Spanish Civil War. So I'm not sure if he would have if his relationship with Pauline would have continued, or if World War II hadn't have broken out, if he would have continued to visit. But it was just sort of a clean break. And he was a broken man in 1939, mostly because of the fall of Spain to the Nazis. And then he leaves to cover the war and comes back in 1945, and he's divorced Pauline. He's been through a relationship with Gellhorn, and then it's all over. And then they drop the bombs, and so his life just moves on, and then he never goes back. And a part of me thinks that was intentional, to preserve those 11 years. You don't want to go back and spoil it. So that's kind of the story of Hemingway in Montana and Hemingway in our part of the country, and it permeates. Did anybody see the Ken Burns documentary? Yeah, and so we see that this interest is still alive, right? And to my friend Dink Bruce, he would say, dude, there's no end to this shit. It's like you can just keep digging and you can read stories, and then that Burns documentary, I was a little disappointed that they didn't touch on Montana, not one bit. But at the same time, I'm kind of a silver linings guy, but at the same time, it kind of adds more value to my book, because that was how I entered into the world of Hemingway scholarship, because it had been omitted by all the biographers. And then the fact that Burns and I'm in pretty tight with the Hemingway Society. They're bringing their conference here, and they were in full contact with Burns, and he could have come and he could have looked it up. But like I said, it's just a little too difficult and a little too far away and a little too remote, and so he didn't. And
That's good. Keep it that way.
yeah, and honestly, that's something that I have to be careful about, because I've lived in Cook City for 29 years, and I used to worry about, oh my goodness, I'm going to bring all these people here. But now, I'm in the tourist business, and in the summer, everything is full. Every hotel room, every rental house, every campground, every campsite, every backcountry spot, it is full. And so I was able to release that guilt and that apprehension by saying, hey, they're coming anyway. So they're coming anyway. So let's just decide who's going to come, not whether people are going to come. And when we think of Hemingway, we think of the hunting and the fishing, and which fits right in, and those are the people we want here. But also food and wine and enjoying life and literature and history. And for, once again, I touched on how important humanities are in my world. I studied and I went to school, but that was in the 90s, and then I kind of got on with my life and kids and living and all the things that happened. But then 25 years later, here I am. So we can provide that without ruining things. And then I did have that overriding fear that my friends would go to their favorite fishing hole and there would be some guy with a beard and a cigar in it, and I'd have to live with that. But and then also Hoosiers. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Cook City, but Hoosiers is a bar in Cook City that opened as a cafe in 1933, and then opened as a bar in 1934 because Prohibition ended. And there's an interview with Grace Anderson, who was the first bartender at Hoosiers. Hoosiers has had 3 bartenders since 1934. There was Grace Anderson, and then Dick Porter, and now it's Rick Porter, and he's tended bar there since the early 70s, since he was like 21. So it's one of those classic old-time Montana dive bars, and but Rick doesn't like tourists, and he doesn't like questions, and he doesn't like books. And so this interview in the 2006 fall fly fishing edition of the Big Sky Journal, there's an interview. Does anybody know Sue Hart or didn't know Sue Hart? Right. So like, a tip of the hat. Like her research, and Richard Wheeler like got this started, and she did great work. And this article is from her, but she managed to interview Grace Anderson, and in the interview, she just mentions casually, yeah, he'd sit at the end of the bar and he didn't want to really talk to anybody, and he was kind of grumpy, and but he'd push his glass across the bar when he wanted to drink. He was just there to write his books, and she puts him there at the end of the bar, and then she says, we were open all night long, and in Cook City, before the Beartooth Highway was put in, those years before that, it was a ghost town. It was a mining town before that, turn of the century, late 1800s. But then when the mining went bust, Cook City was a ghost town. It was like this outpost at the end of the road, and it was grim and miserable. There's a book by Ralph Glidden, who Ralph and Sue's from Belfry. Ralph owned the general store from which Hemingway sent all those works. And where was I? Okay, I lost it. I lost myself there. He wrote a history of Cook City, and then through that history of Cook City, we know when Hemingway was there, and then through that interview with Grace Anderson, we know that Hoosiers was open all night, and that Cook City was pretty desolate. So there's only 3 bars there now. So in 1934, there's not a lot of bars, and there's only going to be one that's open all night. And then in A Man of the World, Hemingway talks about the bar in which this story is set, and then he says, they were open all night long, and they always bought you the first round. They didn't have to do that, but that's how they are. And believe me, it's still that way. So then I was able to not only set Man of the World in Cook City, but actually identify the bar in which it was set. And then I was already pretty sure, and then there's a picture behind the bar at Hoosiers of the place in 1934, and there's a little cabin next to it, and I talked Rick into giving me the picture, and I took it out of the frame, and if you look at the little place next to Hoosiers, it's called the Pilot Cafe, and the 2 bars in the story are called the Pilot and the Index. But as far as like finding somebody in your favorite fishing hole, that bar is like 150 yards from my house. Rick's a good friend of mine, and that's another thing I was very nervous about. So I'm going to read to you the disclaimer I put in the book here about Hoosiers. I wrote, Hoosiers opened in 1934 as Prohibition ended. Hemingway visited here in 36, 38, and 39, and the first person to tend bar was Grace Anderson. She remembered Hemingway coming in the morning or early afternoon, sitting at the end of the bar writing, pushing his glass forward when he wanted another drink. Hoosiers was open all night, just like the bar in A Man of the World. This fact, along with other links to Cook City in the story, means that Hemingway's final story probably takes place at Hoosiers. Cook City has a population of 80, so it's unlikely there would be more than 1 bar open all night. Above the piano in Hoosiers is a picture of the old-timers' fish fry, an event mentioned in Across the River and Into the Trees. And then there is the cautionary note for Rick. Cautionary note, Hoosiers is an old-time bar. There's no food, no television, no jukebox, no internet, no kids, no pictures, no public restroom, and no patience for people not buying drinks. Don't ask any Hemingway questions, and do not enter unless you plan on having a couple of drinks. So it is something I was conscious of, and it was something I was worried about. But after seeing legions of Harley riders and snowmobilers like plow through here, I was able to have the confidence to be like, it's full anyway. Let's bring the Hemingway folks here. And so that is what we're going to do. So the conference is July 16th through the 23rd, and and you can go to HemingwaySociety.org. People in Billings are in a unique position where you could just drive over to Sheridan, spend one night, catch a bunch of events, drive back home, hang out, drive over the pass to Cook City, catch a bunch of events, come back. So you're in a unique position, and there are people coming from all over the world. Like I've been booking rooms for people from Serbia and from China and Israel and Egypt, and when I travel to Paris, it costs me 10 grand, you know, and so people in Billings could drop $250 and a little gas money and participate in the International Hemingway Conference. So I would encourage everybody to do that. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions, and hopefully we can keep it going for a little bit. Yes.
My father, and my parents were old when they had me, but he read a lot of Hemingway. And that would have been back in the 50s, 60s. Was he seeing Hemingway the same way? I always just thought they were adventure hunting stories. And he was a hunter and a gunsmith, but yet was he also seeing the soul of Hemingway and the troubles within his body?
You know, I think the scholarship kind of, you know, went down the rabbit hole more after he died. You know, I'm not sure because I'm not super familiar with criticism, but the criticism like during his life. But it's been, you know, it's been 60 years, you know, since he died, and I think he's just grown in estimation. I think a lot of people read the stories as these great hunting stories and these great adventure stories and things like that, but we didn't know about his life as much. Like I don't think that like the suicide of his father, I don't think that's something that was publicized. When he marries Martha Gellhorn, he's sitting with Martha Gellhorn and a couple of people from Sun Valley, and when they read it, they figure out that his father committed suicide. And so even his third wife didn't know until after reading the book that his father killed himself. So, and also like the things we understand about, like I said, about trauma and things like that. If you think, like Hemingway, they gave him shock therapy at the Mayo Clinic. And I always go to, you know, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and it seems so barbaric. But there was a lack of understanding. And so there was nobody thinking about, oh, he was a boxer and a football player and he was hit in the head a bunch of times and was in wars. Nobody was thinking about like brain trauma like we are now, mostly because of the NFL, you know. People might have been delving into it, but I think like just what we know as a society in general, not just about Hemingway's life, has kind of informed the scholarship. And then just great critics and historians digging these things up a little bit at a time, and that's what's so fun about the scholarship. For me, I thought this would start as a newspaper article or a magazine article, and then the more I read and the more I dug into it, like the more I uncovered, and it just became more and more and more, and like in a deeper story. So, as far as your father reading that, no, I think he was probably just enjoying it for what it is, like at face value. And which you can do, which is the great part about it. You know, you can read The Short Happy Life of Francis McNamara, where they're chasing that buffalo down in the Jeep and jumping out of the gun, like your heart's racing, right? But then with the iceberg theory, when she shoots him, it's like, okay, but then you say, okay, well, did she shoot him on purpose because she's in love with the hunter, or did she shoot him accidentally and she was trying to save his life? Or was she dependent on him being a subservient coward, and that was where she drew her power from? And so when he could actually like successfully hunt the buffalo, he discovered his manhood, and she couldn't live with that. And so then you look at the title and you're like, The Short Happy Life of Francis McNamara. So does that mean the short happy life up until he died from when he was born? Or does that mean that the only happy part of his life was in between the moment he shot the buffalo and the moment his wife shot him in the head? Is that the short happy life of Francis McNamara? And then this is the fun part, you know what I mean? It's like you can read stories over and over again and reassess it. And I think our own experience informs how we perceive Hemingway as well. And his willingness to expose himself on the page, you know, we all have who we are, and we all have who we present to the world. right? And so the caricature, the most interesting man in the world, the tough guy, like that was who he presented himself to the world as. But he absolutely laid himself out on the page, and it's fascinating. Yes.
I very much enjoyed your book. We had a very spirited discussion. But I was, and I noticed in the audience today, there's a lot of women. But I thought that on page 114, and this is what we discussed, Hemingway's intentional use of ambiguity allows the reader to pull different meanings. One may read a story as a young man and pull a certain meaning from it, and then return as an older man and find a completely different meaning. I just feel kind of like in this day and age of gender equality, that we could read a story as a young person.
Yeah.
And so I wondered why you kind of zeroed in on just, well, maybe just a young man should read the story and then an old man. Why did you use that?
Probably just because I'm a male and I'm not, I'm maybe not as careful a writer as I should be. So yeah, that was not intentional, and it's funny when I go to speak at book clubs, it is usually predominantly women, and even in the world of the Hemingway Society, you know, it's Sandra Spouniers who's digging up who's digging up his 17 volumes of letters. They're each this thick, and you know, people like Suzanne Del Gizzo and Verna Kale, like there is a very feminine side to Hemingway scholarship. And that's just a slip. That's just, you know, it's coming from me. I'm a dude. Hemingway was a male. That was not intentional. But it brings up a really good point because of his machismo. But he was able to write from a feminine perspective. I mentioned Indian Camp being the beginning of his fiction because that was the first story in our time. When he arrives in Cook City in 1930, he's doing a reissue of In Our Time. And his editors asked him to change some of the names to keep him from getting sued for libel and slander. But he also wants to include a story called The Up in Michigan. And this is a story that he wrote before all those, but it wasn't included in the initial In Our Time. And it's essentially the story of a date rape. And it's the story of not a super violent date rape, but just like young people in 1920 that did not know how to act and living in a very different era. But he writes it from the perspective of the girl. And even though it's a violent act, it's not like, I gotta be very careful here. But by the end of the story, you are far more sympathetic to the woman than you are the man. And I think that was something that he was able to do. And if you want to take a deeper dive into this and feminism and gender in Hemingway, you should read The Garden of Eden, which is not a particularly great book, but there is a section where he's talking about his relationship, and it's very sexual, but it talks about gender role reversal and sexuality, and I think this is like some of his buried homosexuality, maybe latent homosexuality, or at least acknowledgement of the feminine in him. And you know, it took him 10 years to write about his father's suicide, and it took him, 50 years to get to this. So I will apologize because that was sort of short-sighted, but once again, I'm not an academic, and I am a dude, and so was he, and it just came out that way. Yeah, but it's and I would encourage everybody to join the Hemingway Society as well. Over the holidays during COVID, they did a series of podcasts, and one of them was about one was about race, like rereading Hemingway after the Black Lives Matter movement and our new understanding of race, because he does use some racially charged language, but it's very hard to judge people, by today's standards on what they did 60 years ago. And so some of the language is totally inappropriate, but when we look at Hemingway's life, like when he was in Africa, he hung with the guides, he hung with the Maasai, he hung with the natives, and when he was in Cuba, he hung with the people. And the same, and he would always say, if you want to know a town or a place, you don't go you don't go to, the churches and the city halls. You go to the bars and the cafes, and you meet the people. So there's a great podcast on Hemingway and race. There was also one on Hemingway and gender and sexuality in the wake of the Me Too movement. And it's something this conference and then the Hemingway Society, they are the people that, chase down, want to go run with the bulls, and there's the people that, want to go catch the fish, and there's the people that want to do that go to the Hemingway Look-alike contest. But the academic side of it is very different, and it's not hero worship, and it's very important to separate that. And, myself, like being a father, he was not a good father, and he was not great to all his wives. And so it's just important, it's important to, accept him for who he was, mostly as a writer, you know what I mean? Like there's plenty of the people in the world we can judge, but let's judge him for what we did, and let's not judge me on that one sentence.
Well, you touched on it, but I mean, up in Michigan, he talks all around abortion, never says the word, and that theme was directly in Farewell to Arms. And so this is a time when nobody talked about that.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about issues, but that was a huge issue. And I reread that, and that was something completely over my head when I read it in the 5th grade. I mean, you don't even think about it.
Yeah, 5th grade's a little early for that.
Well, yeah, right. But seriously, it's interesting, and the same thing happens in Farewell to Arms because she's pregnant. The whole thing. I mean,
Yeah.
So
And people also misunderstand, like Hemingway. You have to realize that, well, one, Chub Weaver. I talked a lot about Chub Weaver and For Whom the Bell Tolls, and Tom Weaver. I don't know if you guys knew him, and that's who got me started on this. And his father was Hemingway's, best friend in the area. And Chub Weaver was godfather to Patrick Hemingway. He was his godfather, and this is a Camp Cook outfitter bootlegger, right? But who was the godparents of Hemingway's first child were Alex Toklas and Gertrude Stein, who were lesbian lovers. And so his acceptance of femininity and his acceptance of homosexuality started very, very early, like in his 20s. And his fascination with bullfighters who are like incredibly brave, but also incredibly effeminate, And then there's a great story called A Simple Inquiry, that is about an interrogation of an Italian adjunct by his superiors, and I actually wrote a paper calling it because the guy's sort of effeminate and he doesn't belong in the military, and they are just beating him down with their authority, and I describe it as a psychological rape. But Hemingway was very tuned into this at a very young age, and it's in the work. You just have to dig for it. And what has changed my perspective is that so many people are just so eager to adopt and to embrace the persona, the public persona, which has almost become a caricature of the actual Hemingway. And this is something he perpetuated himself. As he got older and as his skills declined, he was, pounding his chest and exaggerating his stories and things like that, which. So it's almost like he created a monster and then became it, But as the writer before the deterioration, which I think, starts at the end of For Whom the Bell Tolls, which coincidentally it's published like 3 months after he leaves our area. So I think he was at his best here. Just to, it's probably the next question, so I'm going to nip it in the bud. But one of the criticisms I've got was in this book suggesting that he was a good family man. Which and a lot of people have taken issue with that, and I should have been. And I'll be honest, like I have a life, and it fell apart over the last few years, like everybody else's. And so it does need a second edition, and it does need a reworking. But my point in the book is like we all know he wasn't a good family man. If you read Misadventures of a Fly Fisherman, Jack Hemingway says by 1950 my father was dead to me. And then, I don't know if you guys know about the troubles that Gregory Hemingway had, but he died in a jail cell in Missoula, and he had breast implants and was a transvestite, and he really struggled. But what I found is in interviews with the 3 boys, they all look back on their time at the ranch as their favorite time with their father. And there's and so we see him teaching the kids how to ride horses. We see him teaching the kids how to fish. And then there's actually, I have a couple of local sources, and one is a very, very, very hard to find history of the ranches and history of the El Bartee, the Hancock, and the B4 ranches that was written by Ed Spencer. And I think it was like self-published, or Wordsworth Publishing, Cody, but there are no more of them, and I have one of them. And the people there describe him, you know, joining in the kids' baseball games and playing with the kids. So even when his own children weren't there, he was just a different guy. And I think that's what made this such a great time in his career as far as like the work he was able to get done. And there's also Gerald and Sarah Murphy were like kind of wealthy financiers of the expat generation, the lost generation in Paris. And they came to see him in 1932 at the El Bartee. And they came with 2 of their children because the other one had, I think, leukemia, but something terrible. And that was the only trip that he didn't take his, there were none of his children were there. In 1930, it was Jack. In 1936, it was Patrick. 1938, it was Patrick. In 1939, it was all 3. But this was the only trip where he didn't have them. And the Murphys are going through this trauma with their child who died shortly after. And no, it's tuberculosis. And Hemingway was the only one that would go into the room, you know, and visit him. But he takes Honoria Donnelly Murphy, and she's got this memoir called it's named after their villa in France, but it's a memoir. It's also very hard to find, and she describes like the fishing trip that they all took up to Copeland Lake, which is up the Crazy Creek Trail right outside of Cook City. And she explains Hemingway taking her out on the boat, and like the grown-ups are in one boat, he's with her in another boat, and he you know, kind of teaches her how to fish and how to set the hook and how to clean the fish, and she says that of all of her parents' famous friends, that Hemingway was the one that treated us like we were his own kids and listened to us and paid attention to us. So yes, we can all look back on all of his failings, but what I should have maybe been a little more clear about in the book is not suggesting that he was necessarily a great family man, but he was at his best as a father when he was here. And as a wife, like my story starts in 1938 and starts in 1928 and ends in 1939. He was married to one woman for that whole time. Yes, he had an affair with Martha Gellhorn at the end of it, but yeah, we're talking one wife, and all this time he's spending with his children, teaching them. So not as a whole was he a good family man, but if ever he was, it was while he was here. Yes, sir.
I think Pauline especially, but I think Hadley some too. They got into kind of an androgynous thing with their relationship. He had her hair cut short, and then they would switch roles.
Yeah.
We've heard about all that.
Yeah, well, that's something that Burns touched on that was fascinating, because I'd always heard that his mother had dressed him as a girl, but then I have 2 kids, and like, yeah, dude, like, I'm not buying you new shoes. You're wearing your brother's. Like, and we would trade clothes, but then that documentary really shed light on how deep that went. Like she would twin Hemingway and his sister, and that messed with his head. And then when we look at Hadley, she has the short, boyish haircut, and then Pauline kind of moves in on Hadley, and then Hemingway suggests that the 3 of them just keep it going, and then Hadley's not having any of that. But then Pauline has her hair cut short and cropped, and Maria in For Whom the Bell Tolls, and then Martha Gellhorn also has that short cropped hair. And then when we get into his relationship with Mary, that's when we get into the Garden of Eden, and I'm like talking like penetration, like they are trading roles sexually, and so yes, that's a very big part of this like deep, weird, mysterious dude who wrote a lot of books, and now we're starting to understand more. We're understanding more about gender and things like that as a culture and as a society. And so now with this new understanding, we can go back and look at that, and we have the privilege of this kind of new understanding of gender roles. And so that's why the scholarship just keeps going, because like I said, we can look back with new knowledge and reassess that whole part of his life,
No wonder Gregory was so confused. was a physician in Jordan,
Mhm,
Montana.
yeah.
And his last night in town, he went bar hopping dressed up,
Yeah.
and then he was gone.
Yeah, starting fights like as a woman, and yeah, that's not only so Hemingway's obviously gender is a giant part of his thing, and it starts with his mother, and his mother, and he always blamed his mother for why his father committed suicide because she was very domineering, and then he says in letters, and he says in For Whom the Bell Tolls, like he would have never done it if he'd have ever stood up to that bitch. So I mean, we all have parental baggage, you know what I mean? But like, that definitely redefines all of it, and that, and like I said, that's why the scholarship continues, because we can take our knowledge of what we've learned since his death, and then go back and assess his motivation and inspiration for his work. You know. Can I see a hand over here?
Is the old RT off the Chief Joseph?
Yes. The elbow, like if you're familiar with the Chief Joseph Highway, if when it runs into the Beartooth, there's a ranch just to the left right there that you can see from the junction, and that is the Hancock Ranch. And then as you head towards Cook City, there's one down in the valley that you can see from the road. If you park at the junction of 212 and 296, there's a little 2-track that goes to the top of the hill, and that is the best place to see the ranch. But yeah, you will be prosecuted if you if you go down there.
Is the conference gonna stop at the ranch?
I'm just gonna view it from the road. I've approached them, but like the family's only there, much like 80% of the Cook City population is only there from the good time, when the fish are rising and the flowers are popping from late June to the end of August, and that's right when the conference happens, and that's when they're down there. So. No, I'm not taking the people down there. And also they've been very kind to Cook City locals as far as access to the Clark's Fork and stuff like that, because Wyoming is a little different. You can own the river, and they let us fish down there. They let us hunt mushrooms, and so I'm going to do my best to protect their privacy. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, and if anybody's in Cook City, I do have the following Papa's footsteps. But yeah, the cabins right when you come in, those were the Nordquist cabins owned by Olive Nordquist, who was the matriarch of the ranch. And then when you get to the trading post, the big gift shop, that used to be called Cole's Mercantile. And Ralph, who wrote that book on Cook City, met a lady in a hot tub in Arizona who was named Virginia Cole, and she had a memory of him when he owned the store, and he describes the kids, all 3 kids coming in, so that makes it 1939, and trying to steal the whole store. And so that is Hemingway pertinent. The next building down is the Beartooth Cafe. That was built by Lawrence Nordquist in 1937. And then the next building down, the Miners Saloon was built in 1932, and it was a garage. And in one of his letters, he talks about breaking his oil pan up at Cook Pass and having to coast his car all the way down the hill and getting it fixed in a garage in Cook City. So that would probably be the Miners Saloon. And the next building down is the general store, and that's been there since 1886, and that's from where he sent all those great works, because it was a post office at the same time. And what initially, and this is in the book, I don't want to rehash stuff you guys have already read, but what got me started is when Chub Weaver's kid, Tom Weaver, who was already a friend of mine, came in with True at First Light, which is the memoir of his trip to Africa in 1954 and 55, and he goes into a general store in Laitikitok in Nigeria and says, "Hey, I like this place because it reminds me of the general store in Cook City, Montana." And then the next building down on the right side of the road is Hoosiers, where his last story is set. And then if you go down to Silvergate, there's the Grizzly Lodge, the Log Cabin, and the Range Rider. And Silvergate was founded in 1932 when they had decided to start building the Beartooth Highway, and they were taking advantage of that. So all those buildings. I also have another very, very rare memoir called Village Boy by Ralph Nels, who built the Range Rider in 1937, and he talks about Hemingway coming in there in 1938 and 39. So Cook City, most of it was built in anticipation of the Beartooth Highway, and so it was all built during Hemingway's time there. So when you're downtown, you're in the footsteps.
Did you ever think the Beartooth Highway killed it for Hemingway?
Well, he didn't go from 1932 to 1936, and those were the years they were building it. And he talks in a letter in 1932. Once again, I don't know how familiar everybody is, but there's the big gravel pit at Pilot Creek, and that was used for road construction just on the latest road construction project like 10 years ago. But he talks about that gravel pit ruining his favorite stretch of river, and his favorite stretch of river was the confluence of the Pilot Creek and the Clark's Fork, which is right there. So yes, he was also really bummed when he went back to the Irati in Spain and it had been ruined by logging. He was also bummed when they built the new road to Cook City, or to Key West. But also he needs to take a little responsibility, you know, because he was the guy, a lot of people are going down to Key West to because of him. And then he was the first guy to drive the car across the Clark's Fork. And so you can't be the guy that uses the car to get there and then complain about the road. But I would say, yes, the road kept him out from 1932 to 1936. When it was in, you know, all the guides thought it would like run the game off and stuff like that. He did use it to drive back and forth over the pass with Chubb Weaver. Yeah, that might, you know, he did have this notion that all of his favorite private paradises were being ruined, you know. But I think that's something that, you know, we've probably all been in Montana a long time. It's been 29 years for me, but people have this tendency to be like, everybody who sucks that's here, that moved here after me. Like, it was cool, and then the day I got here, everybody else is a jerk. And I think Hemingway kind of fell into that a little bit too. Okay, how'd I do? All right, great. Thank you guys so much, and thank you, Bernie.